Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great, good. I really have to hand it to the people who comment on my videos because they often tell me things I didn't know, which isn't hard, or give me a video idea in response to a question. Now, in my recent video on the history of the Type 38 Arasaka, I noted that the rifle fired the semi-rimmed 6.5mm Arasaka cartridge. Now that prompted a viewer, Steve H4962, to wonder, why did the Japanese go with a semi-rimmed cartridge when successful non-rimmed cartridges already existed? A pretty darn good question, and I figured the wider topic of rimmed cartridges and why they were used and lasted as long as they did might be interesting. So what is a rimmed cartridge? Well, simply, the rim is larger than the diameter of the case body. As we can see with this 303 British cartridge, the rim measures 0.540 inches, while the bottom of the base is 0.455 inches. Now, in the case of another famous rimmed cartridge, 7.62 by 54 millimeter, the rim measures 0.570 inches, while the diameter of the case body is 0.489 inches. And just to state the obvious, a rimless cartridge has a rim that's usually the same diameter of the bottom of the case body. The semi-rimmed cartridge is kind of the in-between of the cartridge family because it still has a larger rim, but not quite as pronounced as the rimmed cartridge. In the case of 6.5 Arasaka, its rim measures 0.476 inches, while the bottom case diameter is 0.451 inches. Another example is 444 Marlin, whose rim is 0.514 inches, while the case diameter is 0.470 inches. Semi-rimmed cartridges, both in the military and civilian worlds, have never been that common. There seem ostensibly obvious advantages compared to rim, but weapons designers tend to be smarter than I am, so I imagine there were good reasons that I haven't been able to learn more about. There are other types of cartridge cases which include belted and rebated, but we won't be discussing those today. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to treat rimmed and semi-rimmed cartridges as one. Now, there are a number of reasons why you would want to avoid using a rimmed cartridge in a rifle when you have the ability to manufacture non-rimmed cartridges. Now, the first and perhaps most obvious one is loading the rifle. Now, if you've ever made a mistake loading a rimmed cartridges into a rifle and then had one round's rim catch on another one while trying to work the action, what's known as rim lock, you know that's an annoyance. Now, that can be alleviated to some extent by using stripper clips or chargers, but it's quite easy to still experience rim lock if you improperly load the clip. Now, the second reason is one that you might not initially think of, and that's magazines. Designing one for a rimmed cartridge can apparently be a pain. Now, once you have a successful magazine, you're out of the woods, but getting there can be challenging. A few years ago, Forgotten Weapons mentioned this issue when he explored the British conversion of the ZB-26 from non-rimmed 8mm Mauser to their rimmed 303 British. Rimmed cartridges can also be a hassle when designing belt-fed machine guns. Thanks to that rim, you don't just simply push the cartridge from the belt into the chamber as most actions do. You have to pull the cartridge out of the back of the belt and then forward into the chamber. So you have an inherently more complicated design as a result. I know what you're saying. Redneck, that was a murderer's row of good excuses not to use rimmed cartridges. So what kind of mad lad would actually make the choice to do so? Well, We live in magical times because chances are every modern firearm you own is reliable. And that wasn't always the case, particularly when firearms shifted from one paradigm to another. Now, one of those paradigm shifts was metallic cartridges. Now, I'm not going to go too deep in the weeds on this topic, but early metallic cartridges could be problematic, and one resulting issue could be poor extraction. Remember, back in ye old fashioned times, they used black powder, and chambers could get fouled up and, when combined with iffy case construction and heat, could lead to extraction issues. A rimmed case makes it easier for an extractor to grab hold of a spent case and pull it out of the chamber. Now, a second reason why many designers opted for a rimmed cartridge was one that most people won't think of, and that's headspace. Rifles that use rimmed cartridges, at least back in the day, don't headspace cartridges off the shoulder, but rather off the rim. Now that has the practical benefit that the length of the case itself really isn't as important. Not saying that a case's length isn't important, merely that you can afford to be less precise with it. In the late 1800s, when countries needed to pour out bulk ammunition for their many European and colonial hootenannies, that more tolerant case length made making ammunition a bit easier. Essentially, due to tolerances in manufacturing at the time, it was thought that head spacing off the rim was more consistent and therefore more reliable. And moreover, the rim helps hold the ammunition in place. The rim of the case enters a recess in the chamber where it's securely held between there and the breech face. Non-rimmed ammunition is typically held in place by the breech face, but also by the shoulder of the case. After most of the issues were resolved with non-rimmed ammunition and it proved to be reasonably reliable, why did so many militaries stick with rimmed ammunition? Well, an effective rimless cartridge was available in 1889, thanks to Mauser's 7.65 by 53 millimeter round. And that's 6 years before Japan's Type 30 and 2 years before Russia's Mosin-Nagant M91. Well, there are a few reasons, and the first is logistics. A military doesn't buy ammunition on a just-in-time basis. They tend to buy it in massive bulk quantities. Your average military, even in the late 1800s, might be sitting on tens of millions of rounds of ammunition, and that represents a tremendous sunk cost. You might have been tempted during the design process of your new rifle to stick with the old cartridge to try and save yourself some money. The greatest enemy of every weapons procurement program in history might actually be Treasury officials. That's probably why the rimmed 303 British round lasted as long as it did despite ongoing iterations to the Lee Enfield rifles. The Brits simply had a massive quantity of a proven round and a supply chain to British and colonial forces that stretched across the planet. Yes, it was rimmed, but there was no point in trying to replace the round, particularly ahead of the obviously oncoming Second World War. Why try supplying the troops in the early days of that war with both 303 British and whatever else they might have tried to replace it with? And another good reason is good old design compatibility. Rimmed cartridges were compatible with the bolt-action rifles and machine guns in use at the time. These firearms were designed to handle the extraction and feeding of rimmed cartridges reliably. Change costs money and introduces potential problems. Rimmed were reliable, or at least perceived as reliable. As I mentioned, you often saw better extraction for rimmed cartridges in adverse conditions. And finally, I've read this, though I can't find primary sources for it. Rimmed cartridges were simpler to manufacture. Frankly, a lot of countries may have had difficulty, financially and technically speaking, being able to build enough machines necessary to form non-rimmed cartridges, and in the quantities that they needed it in. Rimmed makes it easier to have different providers of varying competency levels mass producing the ammunition. So, to directly address the case of 6.5 Arisaka, the semi-rimmed nature provided improved extraction and easier ammunition production, but the less pronounced rim also avoided a lot of the worst issues of magazine feeding. And that's basically why the Japanese stuck with their rimmed 6.5 Arisaka ammunition as long as they did. They only finally decided to replace it not because of whatever issues semi-rimmed imposed, because of the perception that the ammunition wasn't lethal enough during their war in China. At any rate, I hope you found today's video at least be vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. As always, I hope you have yourself a great day. Take care, and bye-bye.